Hi, ma'am. Does it smell good? Yeah. Please don't lick my bread. Thanks. Hi. Wow, what do both of you want? Hi, dog. Okay, I'm gonna keep telling my story, okay? Cool. Hey y'all, how's it going? Welcome to Seed to Plate channel. This is normally a gardening channel, but today I really want to talk about cooking and especially gluten-free bread and especially gluten-free sourdough bread. I do want to give a quick disclaimer about this video before you watch any further. There is actually not going to be a recipe in this video. This is all going to be tips and tricks. The recipes that I've been using for this beautiful bread that I've been making, these recipes actually come out of this cookbook. It's called Gluten-Free Flour Power, and it is written by two people who I don't know them, but if I did know them, I would probably kiss them because they've low-key changed my bread life. So a couple of things to know about me and why I'm making a video on gluten-free bread is because I have diagnosed celiac disease. So that means that my immune system recognizes the gluten protein as an invader and then actually attacks part of my small intestines, which causes major issues. It actually causes like malnutrition. That's the major issue. It's malnutrition. I just don't digest anything after that. So there's a very long, complicated story and explanation. You can find that video down in the description box below. I did a whole video last year about my symptoms, my story, my diagnosis, how I've been doing since, all of that stuff. But just to kind of get that out of the way first, I am completely diagnosed celiac, and celiac is an autoimmune disease. So if you want to get educated about that, I encourage you to watch that video, and also just do some research. I think that's cool too. People with celiac are becoming frequently more diagnosed for a litany of reasons that I could get into. But that's not why you're here. You're here to talk about bread. So the reason I won't be posting a recipe is because these wonderful people have worked very hard to create these recipes, and I do think you should buy this book. If you like to cook and you're gluten-free, I heavily encourage you. Gluten-free Flour Power. I have no affiliation with these people. I was given this book as a gift. I didn't even pay for it. I don't get money from it. I get nothing, okay? This book has just like kind of changed my life. I'm gonna talk about the bread situation. I have a storied history with bread, and if you want just kind of like the tips and tricks, I'll put a time in the description box down below for you to skip to. So if you don't want to hear my stories, you can go there. But my very short story about why I'm so passionate about gluten-free bread is because at the beginning of COVID in 2020, I, like many other people, got really into bread making. I just had a dog join me in the back. She's a Great Dane, that's why she's huge. Anyways, so I got really into bread making at the beginning of COVID, okay, like a lot of people, except I'm gluten-free. So I went on the YouTubes, where you are now, and I typed in gluten-free bread recipe, found a recipe, started using it. Lo and behold, the main thing in the bread that gave it a gluten-like structure for the yeast to rise and for it to have a structure is called psyllium husk powder. Psyllium husk powder is a laxative. So what did I do? I was like, wow, this bread's so good. I'm just gonna add more. And so I added more and I was messing with the recipe. And I got to a point where I had about 4 tablespoons of psyllium husk powder in my recipe. That's a lot. So basically, I poisoned a lot of my loved ones with my delicious bread. And when I say poisoned, I do mean that because one of them actually likened it to their prep for a colonoscopy. And if you've never done that, you basically have to drink like 2 bottles of Miralax or something, and like you have like 0 bowel control. So that's what my delicious bread was doing to my loved ones. So I had not made ever since this revelation, which is a much longer story that I don't really have permission from all parties to tell. So I'm gonna leave it at that very surface level. Once I found out that I was poisoning my loved ones with laxatives in my bread, I stopped making gluten-free bread, which probably makes sense if you care for your digestive health at all. So after I found out I was poisoning my loved ones, yeah, it was bad. I shouldn't have done it. Okay, you don't have to yell at me. I know I poisoned people. I'm not proud, okay? Okay, so after this little revelation, and I got this book uses no psyllium husk powder, and it also uses a custom flour blend that you actually make yourself. Now, I did a little math, and for me, making this custom flour blend and how much I bake is actually cheaper than buying pre-made gluten-free flour. So those are the first few things. The next thing to know is I am the child of some serious foodies. Like, they had a catering business, and also my dad ran country clubs that had a lot of fine dining, and he was really into like the food and beverage part of things. So I grew up just like, I don't know, knowing what flavor was and knowing what tasted good and what didn't. And I kind of was able to refine my palate, if you will. And gluten-free was hard because there's a lot of stuff that's real different. And here, I'll show you the texture of the bread. I'm gonna tell you something. The Char gluten-free bread that they sell at Costco in the 2-packs has psyllium husk powder in it. So if you're wondering if you're gluten-free, why you're still having problems, check in your processed foods for psyllium husk powder. And I'm not being a conspiracy theorist, it's literally a laxative, Google it, okay? Life is hard out here for us gluten-free folk. Like, it's hard. We get cross-contaminated at restaurants. People don't believe us when we tell them that it's an actual disease that like causes permanent damage to our bodies. And then we have to deal with bullshit stuff like the most popular gluten-free bread video on YouTube having a laxative in it. Oh, and here's my other post-rant, by the way, that I remembered after I actually got done filming that whole shebang, okay, is the other thing that's difficult out here for the gluten-free person looking for recipes online is some of these dang food bloggers who never cut their bread open. And I'm telling you right now, it's easy to make something look good on the outside, but when you cut it open, it's gummy and it's weird and it's not done all the way. And so if you ever find a gluten-free bread recipe on the internet and they don't show you what the inside looks like, don't waste your time. Hot take, but don't do it. If they're not willing to show you the crumb, then they're probably a fake. Buy this book. I'm gonna link it down below. It's not an affiliate link. I make $0 from recommending this. However, I did make this loaf of bread today that you are going to see me make and have some tips and tricks in there. I did make this loaf of bread today to take to my family that I poisoned 2 years ago with psyllium husk bread. We actually call it shit bread in my family. And I feel like that's important for you to know. So I'm gonna redeem myself with some gluten-free bread. And it smells amazing. It has good texture. Now, I will say as a caveat, you cannot always assume that your gluten-free bread is going to taste like regular bread because it's just not. And here's the other thing is it doesn't have any preservatives, so you have to keep it in the fridge. So that means for sandwich bread like this was made in a Pullman loaf pan. It is a sourdough gluten-free bread. And I already showed you the texture. It's a beautiful texture. So for this bread, it has to be kept in the fridge and therefore is best toasted. It's not pre-sliced. And the whole like texture difference is something you just like gotta get on the train with. I will say, gluten-free bread doesn't get soggy. It is sog resistant, which everybody should be happy about. So I'm gonna stop going off on my freaking rant. If you like cooking and if you are gluten-free, I'm gonna say it one last time. This book is friggin' life-changing. So let's go make some bread. All right, y'all, first things first is your starter. My starter is fed. It is nice and bubbly. I do keep it at room temperature. I do not keep it in the fridge as of right now, but who knows? That could change. We're going to start with flaxseed meal. You can use regular or golden, depending on what color you want your bread, and some sorghum flour for the starter. I do have to toss together a flour blend from the book really quick. They actually have 3 different types of flour blends you can use for any of these recipes. One of them is more akin to like a whole wheat flour that's going to be more dense, and one is a low allergy blend for those of you who need like dairy-free, soy-free, all of that stuff. I do try and get this as combined as humanly possible, but I feel like it's kind of hard. So honestly, the best method that I have found is putting a top on this thing and just shaking it as absolutely violently as you can. I put this in because it was oddly satisfying, so you're welcome. I'm gonna be annoying for a second. You need a food scale. It's very important. Now we are even going to weigh our water. That's how important a food scale is to this whole process. They do have regular measurements, but food scales are important, guys. Now we're going to bloom our yeast. And yeast actually needs sugar to feed on. So you want to actually mix these together pretty well so that the yeast actually blooms in the water and doesn't just stick to all the sugar at the bottom. So you want to like really stir this all together. And then if your yeast does not bloom, aka it doesn't get foamy, that means your yeast is not active and you need new yeast. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Brooke, this is sourdough bread. Why are we using yeast? And the answer is I don't know because I didn't write this book. However, the bread is amazing and I will follow what these people tell me to do until the end of time. So just use the yeast and it'll be fine. Now using this adorably tiny whisk, I am actually going to mix this all together. And this is also very important. You really want to agitate the yeast to get it to wake up and come in contact with the sugar molecules. Yeast is a bacteria, and so it needs something to feed on, and it needs a warm environment, which is why they always tell you to use lukewarm water when doing this. So just do your yeast a favor and wake it up and move it around. All right, y'all, now we are going to weigh out our starter, and look at how airy and beautiful this is. This means we've captured a lot of those wild yeasts out of the air, and wild yeast just means it's not commercially produced yeast. And so with the wild yeast, this is how bread used to be made before commercial yeast was invented, was they would leave this starter out, let it capture all of the wild yeast, and that's how people's bread would rise. And that's kind of how bread started. It wasn't this like super airy bread that we see at the store now that's full of a bunch of sugar and processed stuff. So something interesting I've picked up on in general in gluten-free baking is it requires a lot more fat, simply for hydration's sake. So this recipe for 1 loaf of bread actually takes 6 whole eggs. And the other thing that I find interesting about these gluten-free recipes is that you're really trying to whip in as much air as humanly possible. That's why this recipe actually has you mix the eggs, the starter, and then the yeast, water, sugar mixture in a blender, and you whip it into a homogeneous liquid that you then add into the flour. So along with this idea of whipping air into the mixture, we're going to use the paddle attachment, which you would normally use for something like cookie dough or something like that, but you actually really need it to whip the air necessary into this mixture. And now we're going to weigh out our flour. So I already made the flour blend, and now we're going to weigh out how much flour we actually need for the recipe. And the reason that weighing is important is because the different things in the flour, like the starches and the different flours within the flour blend, they all weigh different amounts. So that's why the weighing is vitally crucial to this whole process. Ooh, I almost forgot the salt. That would have been devastating. I don't understand the science of why salt's so important to bread,
but I do know it's vitally important, so there's that. Now, this yeast mixture didn't bloom as much as I wanted it to be honest, which tells me my yeast is not as good as it used to be, which makes sense because it's a couple years old. It was a pandemic yeast purchase, as I'm sure many of us have made, but this is the process of whipping in that air. Please ignore my double chin, which I'm sure you weren't looking at until right now, but this is the frothiness you want to achieve. And then with your mixer on somewhat low speed, you want to steadily stream in the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients. Now we will kick up the speed of the mixer here, but I have found that this like steady stream of the wet ingredients is really important to getting everything incorporated. And here's a really terrible shot, but I wanted to show you how wet the dough looks when you first put everything in. It's gonna look weird, but I promise, just follow the process and it will look much better once it starts to whip. And here it is on high speed, looking a lot more like dough. So here's one of the nice things about gluten-free dough. It's incredibly forgiving, because the thing that you really get stressed about making regular bread or regular gluten anything, especially sourdough bread though, is the shape, right? The stretching, the folding, the baskets, the carving with the cutting into the thing, right? Like, that is a really stressful part, or at least it seems like it, for bread baking. You don't have to deal with that with gluten-free bread because you're not dealing with the gluten, which is the complicated part. So really, you can kind of shape this however you wish. Now we're going to cover tightly with plastic wrap. I did have an idea of doing this with a plastic shower cap, like without a liner, like one that you haven't used, because you don't want your bread to taste or smell like shampoo. But you want to cover this with plastic wrap to continue to have it provide a nice humid, damp, warm environment. And another key here is you want to let it rise somewhere that's warm. I had just used my oven making breakfast before I made this bread, and so the top of my stove was still pretty warm as it was trying to cool down. So that's where I chose to rise my bread. Okay, y'all, this bread has been rising for about 3 hours on a warm stove, and it is just about doubled in size. You're gonna notice it's a lot more airy, and it just starting to look more like bread, honestly. All right, and before all you cast iron purists come after me, I'm not good at keeping my cast iron seasoned, and this bread was for my family, and so I just didn't want it to stick, so I used a little bit of Pam, okay? Sue me. Now, there's also no graceful way to do this transfer, which is what I was currently contemplating there, and my brain cells were not working hard enough. So you really just kind of gotta go for it and, like, dump it into the pan, and yeah, just hope it goes well, really. Now, having a large pan with a lid is really important here. This is a 3-quart Lodge Dutch oven, basically, but with handles instead of a top handle. It's got a side handle. And you can either use a Dutch oven, or I have also done a sandwich loaf with this and used foil. That also worked really, really well. So as long as you have a large pan, I think you could probably get away with using foil and it would be totally fine. We're just going to rewrap this guy with plastic wrap, and then it is in for another 2-hour rise in a warm spot. So I just put it back in the same spot in the oven, and we'll be back in 2 hours. All right, y'all, it's bread baking time. We are fully risen. Now this bread will rise and conform to whatever container you put it in, so just be mindful of that. But we're going to start it at 400 degrees for the first 45 minutes with the lid on. Also, don't come at me again because the top of my cast iron's rusted, okay? I know that. I'm very aware. All right, y'all. Here's what I didn't get to show you. You actually turn down the temperature to 350 for another 45 minutes, and then what you're seeing now is me taking it out of the oven so that I can take the top off and check it out and see how it's progressing. Once you take the top off, you turn it down to 300 and you let it brown. This is the part where you kind of got to go with your gut and really kind of go by smell, go by look. The bread is already fairly brown, but it definitely has a little bit more to go. So we're going to turn down that oven, stick the bread back in, and see where we end up, and just kind of go by our intuition. Now, if all else fails and you're a numbers person, you can always take the temperature of your bread. This bread has to be 210 to 212 degrees. Also, mad shout out to my partner for getting this really awesome instant read thermometer. I don't think he actually watches my videos, but honey, if you do, I think this may be one of my favorite kitchen purchases you've ever made, other than my new Japanese steel knife. So we're only at 210 degrees. I want to get it a little bit higher because this bread's for my family and I don't want it to be too gummy. So we're going to stick it back in. So I only actually put the bread in for another like 5 minutes and it got up to 212, which was the temperature I wanted at, just to make sure that it wasn't too dense or underdone in any way, since this loaf was for my family. The other big trick I've learned about any gluten-free bread you're making is that getting it out of the pan so that the steam can come out of the bottom is like a weirdly essential part of your gluten-free bread not being overly dense or gummy in the middle. And this is our finished product, y'all. Thanks so much for joining me today. Highly recommend getting this cookbook. Check out all the links down below in the description box. And happy cooking!
Oh my god, I'm tired after that. That was a long monologue. Good lord.